What is the most underrated crime ever committed? In a world defined by fraudulent victimhood and fictitious villains, this is a worthwhile question to ask. We have unfortunately so lost what constitutes a crime in today's world that we often lose sight of who the truly victimized in our society are. As a country that supposedly has a history of elevating the most marginalized and vulnerable, this is a great stain on our history, and one that we should be looking to rectify. Some crimes are easy to spot, obviously. On a general level, we know that mugging an old lady for a purse or punching a baby while walking down the street are heinous acts. Throughout the pages of history, we know that throwing Jews into gas chambers and forcing Ukrainian farmers into work camps are unforgivable offenses. The human brain is wired for justice. We know when something trips that wire almost as soon as we see it. And this is a very good thing, by the way, if tuned properly. The thing that elevates crime is the damage it does to its victims. The more harm an action does to someone or something, the more retribution that action deserves as a consequence. This is the reason why the prison sentences for first-degree murder are different than shoplifting, for example. Justice must be hierarchical and tiered, or it's not justice at all. I've long thought hard and long about this issue for the entirety of my time writing. I have read about and seen some of the most horrible atrocities ever committed, some so horrible that they're almost uncomfortable mentioning out loud, ranging from authoritarian regimes to bank robberies to government corruption to undercover coups. The level of human depravity and evil that seemingly iterates itself unimpeded over time is depressing, to say the minimum. It's not an easy task to crown one as the champion, to see exactly which one takes the cake. This is also a somewhat subjective claim to make. Everyone has their own biases on which depravity and evil reigns supreme. I do, and don't pretend to do otherwise. My bias, my criteria for judgment, rests on the following. Who is so deliberately lied to and wronged by those in power that they have never been the same since? It is not power itself, but rather its abuse towards a group or person that has none of it, and is lied to under false pretenses, that most inform my verdict as to which crime stands alone as the greatest of them all. In my estimation, the most underrated crime in modern world history, one that is shockingly almost never talked about, is the systemic destruction and obliteration of the American black family. When centered around the long-standing plights of black people in the United States, two eras stand out, and rightly so: Jim Crow and slavery. These two epochs, arguably the two biggest stains on American history, are talked about constantly, and for good reason. They represent America's two largest failures of its promises of its founding documents, showing the letdown of our values on the grandest scale possible. But what's far more interesting, at least to me, is what happened between those two events. The 100 years between the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 tell a grand, horrible story of rise and fall, of growth and decline, of construction and deconstruction. Many people do not know this story, mostly due to an ahistorical and corrupted teaching of just how malicious our government can be, and as to why so many of the problems that currently plague black Americans currently exist. This is a very unpopular narrative, which is why it's not talked about all that much. The reasonings for the current plights of black Americans are very diverse. DEI policies, single motherhood, violent crime. Almost every institution, from corporate boardrooms to federal policies on pilot quotas for major airlines, is blamed, cited as quote-unquote part of the problem. But as the root of all of them is the same: the complete dismantling of the black family due to government intervention. Let's begin by citing some remarkable statistics, which again are almost never talked about. Between the years of 1890 and 1940, for example, the black marriage rate, not even 3 decades removed from slavery, was higher than that of whites. In the 1950s, under Jim Crow, black Americans were outpacing white Americans in wage growth. The out-of-wedlock birth rates for black Americans was around 19% in 1940, compared to 28% for white Americans. All of these say something significant. The black family, during a time of immense struggle and strife in regards to economic well-being, legislative injustice, and social immobility, was thriving against all odds. But then something changed. Almost immediately after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which most Americans dubbed the famous quote-unquote mountaintop that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, black America went into the toilet. Almost all of the positive trends centered around black Americans, and most specifically the black family, inverted themselves almost immediately. More than half a century later, the results have been nothing short of disastrous. Single motherhood rates of black children are, across all major data sources, hovering around an astonishing 70% or above that. Only around 13% of the total population, black people, and black men in particular, commit more violent crimes and engage in more overall criminality than any other group on the planet. Black children go to worse schools, are raised in more unstable home environments, and have a greater chance to be impoverished due to these and many other factors. This is a stunning thing to observe by itself, but particularly when you're actually given the context to what the backdrop of Black America was before the engine stalled out in midair. What could have possibly changed? How could things have been going so good and then started to go so bad? More importantly, why have things not gotten better but worse over time? And these are all worthwhile questions. Fortunately and unfortunately, they all have a common answer. The institution of the Black family was targeted, zeroed in on, and obliterated, primarily by the United States government. Especially coming from someone like me, this may seem strange. Particularly over the past 5 years, there have been much made of the quote-unquote systemic racism argument in America. Most of these arguments were, and still are, half-baked, lazy, and more than likely racist in their own sense. That's what quote-unquote being an anti-racist is, after all. So given all of this, it's almost outrageous to believe that I would give this argument any credence. But I do. I am still the biggest believer, with plenty of evidence to back it up, by the way, that the largest factor into whether or not a person succeeds or fails comes down to one factor: the choices they make. We have far more agency into how we choose to live than we would otherwise believe. Most people are either purposefully ignorant or just simply unaware of that fact, which is why their lives are not where they would like to be. When you want to look at why a person is where they are, simply look at the choices they make. More than likely, it will tell you exactly why and how they got to their current position. However, that said, when you really dig into the evidence of the breakdown and destruction of the American Black family, there is one villain that sticks out: the United States government. The irony of the quote-unquote systemic racism argument is the very best case for that argument is the system itself, the very thing that perpetuates the lie that somehow Americans themselves, the vast majority of whom have no ill will towards Black people at all, have somehow held Black Americans back from the American dream. But this is a lie. Rather, it is the American government that has completely dismantled the core institution of any culture in Black culture: the family. If you destroy the family, as we will see, everything else around the family degenerates, and quickly at that. When the family dissolves, it's only a matter of time before everything involving the family, i.e. all things, completely melt away, along with all hope for a successful future. Before we get into how the United States government destroyed the Black family, it's important to understand why Black people were so successful beforehand, particularly in the element of their families. And the answer is really quite simple. Black people in America didn't trust the government at all, and for good reason. Due to centuries of wrongs committed against them by the United States government, ranging from slavery to sharecropping to Jim Crow, Black people understandably looked outside of the government for help to get them to live better lives for themselves, their families, and their communities. And remarkably, they found it. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the last thing Black Americans wanted to do is leech off of the government that has allowed their enslavement for more than 2 centuries. So the question then is, where do they go for support? The answer? Social institutions, as all healthy societies and demographics do. The marketplace, small business, the church, their neighbors. Particularly as oppression against Blacks was institutionalized in the Jim Crow South at the federal level, Black Americans increasingly leaned into social institutions for how to live life to the full. And to their immense credit, after one of the gravest periods of injustice the modern world has known, they found it. Black people, as mentioned, were the most successful demographic in the country in some of the most important areas that matter because of one thing. They leaned away from the government and leaned into their developing social fabric and the institutions that bolstered it, and most specifically, the family. This was a threat to the United States government. The only way a bureaucracy can grow and seep into the lives of its citizens is through dependence on that bureaucracy by its citizens. Like any parasite, it needs something to feed off of. Any threat to that source of energy and sustenance, and it dies, cast off as useless. The growing power of the U.S. government, which is slowly but surely beginning to consume the entirety of American life, saw the burgeoning social fabric of America as its biggest threat. This was particularly true when it came to Black people at this point in American life. Black Americans were, not too long ago, their biggest burden of proof as to how the government was able to maintain power over people. But now, Black people were beginning to thrive, a living, throbbing middle finger to the quote-unquote power of the U.S. government had over its citizens. This infuriated the government and the people who ran it. Seeing this, those people and the government decided to make an example by targeting the Black family, the combination that was proving deadly to their botched theory of government dependence. The government rightly recognized the biggest threat to their growth in power were social institutions, namely religion, local communities, and families. So to wrest power back from the citizenry, they put in a plan to decimate the black family, to tear down the latest sacred cow that was elevated as an alternative to their own tyranny. Led by the American Democrat Party, the party of the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow, segregation, and slavery, the federal government put their plan into motion first by leveraging outside forces and influences. The biggest lever they chose to pull was by empowering a woman named Margaret Sanger. Sanger, an avowed white supremacist who hated black people, sought funding from the federal government, which was granted, to fund an organization that would expedite the process of destroying the black family at its root: children. The name of that institution was called Planned Parenthood. Sanger's strategy, contrary to popular belief, was not to quote-unquote provide health care to women who were of poor economic means and in danger of social ostracization. Instead, her goal was simple: the extermination of the black race through eugenics and infanticide. Planned Parenthood, infused by funding from the federal government, was deliberately targeted at black people to prey on them, to keep them from reproducing. The way Sanger chose to do this was to embed Planned Parenthood locations in the most densely populated areas where black people resided, namely, particularly as the 20th century began and urbanization began to take hold, urban areas in packed cities. To most black people who were still climbing the economic hierarchy, any economic setback is equivalent to the apocalypse, just as it is for any poor person. Throw a wrench into your budget of any size, and your whole life can crumble. This is exactly what Sanger infused her strategy of evangelizing abortion for black Americans. Leveraging the narratives of economics and social norms, the federal government and Planned Parenthood began to take them into their clutches. Now, abortion was a form of quote-unquote liberation. It was part of quote-unquote the culture. The effects of this have been catastrophic. Just before 2020 began, 1 million black babies were aborted in New York City in 2018 alone. This move by Planned Parenthood was the first decisive shift in the increasingly abusive relationship between black Americans and the federal government. More and more, the government began to wrap their arms around black Americans, worming their way in to destroy the family structure. The messaging was still as covert as ever. The Democrats, unbelievably, were now the party of black people, even though it was them who had advocated for the most grave injustices in their history. Even Orwell couldn't dream of a psyop this grand. Yet they could not take a swing, truly, until they had a true believer in a position of power to, in their view, permanently subjugate black people by breaking apart the family. Unfortunately, they found one in the form of Lyndon Baines Johnson, a lifelong swamp creature who manipulated his way into becoming John F. Kennedy's vice president when he won the White House in 1960. Kennedy and Johnson hated each other personally, but needed each other politically. LBJ historically was viewed, and is still viewed largely, as the most pro-black president up until Barack Obama took office in 2008. But this is also a lie. LBJ was an open and vicious racist. Hailing from the plights of poverty in Texas, Johnson loathed black people and made no real attempts at hiding it. The only way he was able to do so was by attaching himself to Kennedy, who was a true believer in civil and equal rights for all races. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 and Johnson sworn in, he inherited his agenda, but with a twist. Having the documents already drafted, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, taking the credit for Kennedy's bold initiative to establish legal equality for all Americans. Johnson knew that this massive achievement would firmly establish loyalty between black people and his party. Quote, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years, he smugly said as he walked off the stage after signing. To solidify those 200 years, Johnson took Kennedy's agenda and flipped it in a malicious twist. That twist was called the quote-unquote Great Society Initiative. Black America, feeling the effects of Sanger's work, the Vietnam War, and Jim Crow, among other things, was finding it harder and harder to climb the economic ladder. However, instead of looking to their social institutions for their help, they were beginning to look for solutions elsewhere: the government. The Great Society was Johnson's quote-unquote solution to that quote-unquote problem of poverty, particularly for black Americans. The Great Society was designed, in theory, to help give poor people, predominantly ethnic minorities, a leg up through a series of entitlement programs, including subsidized housing, wage replacement, and healthcare options. Ergo, no one had to rely on their families, their neighbors, their church, their synagogue, their mosque, or their local communities for help anymore. Now, all they had to do was reach out to their Uncle Sam. Forget all those other people. They're useless. But this wasn't true. This was not a poverty alleviation program. Rather, it was a wealth transfer program. All the Great Society did was transfer the control of poverty from the people themselves, who could actually do something about it, to the government, who didn't want to do anything about it. As long as they had their gravy train running apace, complete with large government revenues from taxation and increasingly dependent voters, the machine kept humming apace. But the death blow to the black family, dealt once again by the United States government, came shortly afterwards. The sexual revolution, one of the most destructive social movements in history, was running right alongside civil rights and maliciously began to blend in with civil rights itself. It was no longer enough that all ethnicities were equal. Now, all lifestyle choices had to be equal as well. There was no questioning of morality or values anymore. What are you, a racist or something? The primary purpose of the sexual revolution, the detachment of sex from commitment, resulted in the two final death blows to the already crumbling institution of the black family, and to a large extent, the poor family. No-fault divorce and an alleviation of fathers. Now, divorce, something that was once largely shamed and hard to come by for good reason, could be obtained with ease. In addition, with fathers only being viewed as, in some cases, a revenue stream, the devaluation of masculinity began to skyrocket. As the old saying went, some women began to need a man, like a fish needed a bicycle. 50 years later, we now see the consequences of these heinous actions. The United States government has ravaged the black family, almost to beyond repair. A record number of black children grow up in single-parent households. The vast majority of the most popular brand of music, hip-hop, is centered around drugs, sex, abusing women, and killing people, mostly promoted, by the way, by white people. The vast majority of crimes are disproportionately committed by young black males. This is not, by the way, because black people are naturally predisposed to do any of these things, because they're not. It's because of design, social engineering, that black America is at the current state it is in, and has been for a long time. The biggest villain? The United States government, who largely started the domino effect of all of this to happen. But black Americans were just the guinea pigs for the social experiment surrounding the family, as they have been for so many other tragic events of our history. The same is now true for all families in America. It has been so steeped into the foundations of our culture that it's almost impossible to see the forest through the trees anymore. The American family is in shambles, largely across poor communities, whether that be in urban black environments of Chicago or white former factory towns in Appalachia. The problem of the American family is the most important one our ruling class could be attempting to solve, as we will see. So why is no one solving it? The answer to this is simple, because it's really hard. It was really hard to undo the family. Putting Humpty Dumpty back together again will prove far more challenging. But we must try, because the American family, when constituted correctly, is the most impactful driving force for a healthy and value-driven culture and society. When you want to look at the health of a culture, look at the health of its families, and by extension, their neighborhoods, communities, cities, and states. The reason why our culture is so sick is because our families are sick. Any attempt to avoid this reality is to avoid the solution, which is exactly why our elites have always avoided it.